All right, so again, in case you forgot or you couldn't read, this is Introduction to Criminal Justice. I'm Dr. Clay, and today we're talking about just a very high-level overview of criminal justice in America. So I know a lot of you come to this class with like preconceived notions as to what exactly the criminal justice system is like in the United States. I'll tell you this, law and order, not how life goes. Like I physically can't watch Law and Order anymore because I scream at the TV. You can't do that, and like it's not healthy. I take care of my dad. He lives with me, and I like to screw with him sometimes. He'll be in like his room watching NCIS, and I'll come in and I'm like, "This is complete bullshit," and then I'll explain to him for an hour why it's complete bullshit, so he misses the rest of the show. Is what it is. That being said, that's the picture you kind of get, all right? You kind of get this picture of there's an investigation, there's arrest, there's trial, there's sentencing, there's prison, et cetera, et cetera. Not exactly how it goes. From a very high level perspective, that's decent. But hopefully today we're going to dispel some of the rumors, some of the thoughts of the criminal justice process, and people's conceptions of criminal justice in general. So that's what today is going to be about, is just trying to start jumping in with very basics. And then we'll talk about some statistics, but what the public perceives versus what's actually true. All right, so again, for this class, keep an open mind because things can change. So, that being said, in case it's been a while since you've had civics, or if you never took American civics, here's a breakdown of basically American civics, right? The highlights of it. So, the US Constitution is the basis of our justice system, right? It's the base. It provides the rights, it expounds what you're supposed to do, et cetera, et cetera. Until we have the ratification of the 14th Amendment, the US Constitution only applied to federal crimes and federal trials. Then when we get the ratification of the 14th Amendment, we start a process known as selective incorporation, where we say, hey, the federal government's rules now apply to the states. In terms of search and seizure, religion, you name it, it finally started to apply to the states. So that's where the Constitution establishes a federalized government, right? We have feds on one side, states on the other side. And what we're going to see, and we'll get to, I think, a slide on it. These two things, the feds and the states, are very, very different in terms of what they're concerned with, what constitutes a crime, how they investigate, everything. That being said, the Constitution also established checks and balances. Right? So we have the legislative branch, which this is probably exactly what you were told. The legislative branch makes the law, the executive branch enforces the law, and the judicial branch interprets the law. Now that's great for high school level. In reality, each one of these branches of government makes law. Right? So if we talk about legislative branch, that's where we think about traditional codes, statutes, laws. That's where they come from. We look at the executive branch. This includes administrative agencies. So Social Security, the EPA, any number of the alphabet soup come from the executive branch. They make rules. Those rules have the full force and weight of the law. And then the judicial branch, it makes case law. Right? So basically, what happens is the legislature puts a nice framework into place, puts a frame. Right? And so somebody's arrested, it goes to the courts. The courts have this frame. But there's nothing in the middle. Right? There's no painting for them to look at. So they start to paint. Right? And if the legislature doesn't mind it, the courts can kind of keep making the law and keep refining it, refining it, refining it. If the legislature doesn't like it, then the legislature passes more specific laws. Right? So again, we're kind of filling in. That's what the judicial branch does. They fill in the law. And each one has a unique role in administering criminal justice, which criminal justice is the term in itself that has many, many implications. What is truly just? What is not truly just? Now, we're talking about the administration of criminal justice. We're talking about the structure, functions, processes, the agencies involved that deal with the management of crime. So what we're really looking at and how this course is structured and broken down is we're looking at basically the police, the courts, and corrections. Right? That's the three areas that are responsible for administering criminal justice. And we'll get into debates about whether it's just or not just, all that lovely jazz. But for now, that's where we're at. All right? So, the criminal justice system. The term system is a misnomer. System implies that criminal justice functions in an organized, coherent way. It doesn't. It's a very interesting process. Right? So again, we have independent parts where you can see the checks and balances. You have the police. The police are a member of the executive branch. You have the courts, member of the judicial branch. And you have corrections, which is again a member of the executive branch. Right? Well, theoretically, the legislature makes laws. So when we say criminal justice system, there's not a single system in the United States. Instead, we have 51 separate criminal justice systems. So we have the feds, they have their own criminal justice system. We have the states. Each state has their own criminal justice system. And no two are alike. There'll be similarities, there'll be commonalities, but no two are exactly alike. Right? So if you think about it, you think about it as operating as a criminal justice network. Criminal justice network, where you have independent moving parts. A lot of them that can work with each other. You commit a crime in one state, it goes to another state, might not be a crime, might be a federal crime, might not be a state crime, vice versa. You have to figure all that level jazz out. So there is lacking consistency. So what I say always is law, which predicates criminal justice, is an invisible line. Right? It's an invisible line. Because it's all bullshit. And I say bullshit, even though I love it. Just think about it. We are sitting in, if you're not familiar with the area, we're sitting in the state of New York. The state of New York is now criminal to buy tobacco if you're under the age of 21. Pennsylvania, on the other hand, which is about 5 miles that way, you can buy it at 18. Right? And what's the difference? What's the difference between Pennsylvania and New York? What do you have to cross to get to Pennsylvania? The border, right? The border. It's an invisible fucking line, right? It's like, okay, we're gonna make this little imaginary part here, a little imaginary part here. It'll all be this way, this imaginary part. But if you step on this side of the imaginary part, then it's criminal, right? So that's why I say criminal justice is not cohesive. Now, there are a lot of similarities. You'll see a lot of the laws remain the same. A lot of times we take states take their cues from the feds, but the feds are completely different as well. right? When we say they're completely different, based on the invisible line, what side you are on the invisible line dictates what prison you go to, what court system you get, what rights you get, etc. So knowing where you are is very important, because we basically impose this belief, this idea, this notion that you know the law at all times. Wherever you are, you know the entire law. I'm a lawyer. I have no clue about half the shit of law, because I specialize. We all specialize in different areas. But theoretically, we're all supposed to know at all times where we are in terms of the invisible line, what's criminal, what's not criminal. Which makes sense, it's really interesting. If you take my criminal law 1 class, you'll get this, and I'll do that now. Let's say, your name, ma'am? Caroline? Caroline, okay. So let's say, your name. Say again? Leslie, okay. So Leslie's gonna be the border. You're down an imaginary line, right? So let's say I really have a problem with blonde-haired women who wear Elmira college sweatshirts. And this is New York. On the other side of us is Pennsylvania. New York doesn't have the death penalty, Pennsylvania does. I take a gun, I'm standing right on here on the border. I shoot Leslie, or excuse me, I shoot Caroline, and Caroline dies. I know it's not very good to do right now, but what just happened? Where can I be charged? What can I be charged with? Can I be charged with murder in the state of New York? Did the murder occur here? No, the murder, the physical death occurred in Pennsylvania. But I'm in New York. So can I be charged with Pennsylvania with murder? Even though I've never stepped foot in Pennsylvania? It's just absolutely. All right, so this is the cheat sheet answer. You don't need to know this, but in New York, I would be charged with attempted murder. Then in Pennsylvania, I'd be charged with murder. Right? And we're talking about things like dual jeopardy, we'll get into that later. Dual jeopardy doesn't apply to sovereigns. So each state is considered a sovereign, and the federal government is considered a sovereign. All right, so let's say that you, actually, when I first started teaching, I had a guy come to me, he was a lieutenant in a drug cartel who had just been indicted. He's like, what do? I'm like, I'm like, did you do it? Yeah. He goes, but they didn't find half the stuff in my house. I'm like, flush the stuff in your house. Like, they can come back. But let's say that we have like a drug cartel, right? And again, as Leslie as the border, my drug cartel is very small, right? Basically, I manufacture goods here, and I sell them over the border here. I get arrested. I can be arrested for the manufacture of whatever drugs, transportation of drugs. That's the big one, transportation of drugs in New York. That's what I did. Then when I get out of prison, I can be immediately charged by Pennsylvania for the administration of drugs. Then when I get out of prison in Pennsylvania, I can be charged by the feds for administration of drugs. That's when we talk sovereigns and dual jeopardy. You can definitely be charged with the same crime twice or 3 times, depending on the states and what they do. So again, that's why I say we don't really have a system. System implies a unique process that we all follow. We just have this broad network, right? So again, laws based on the invisible line. Now, when we think about crime, we have conflicting models. We either think about crime from the due process model, or we think about crime from the crime control model. So these have been the 2 kind of guiding models throughout history. So, as you know, I'm very defense-oriented. So I love the due process model. Basically, what happens in the due process model is we say it's a society. We want to protect individual rights above all else. Right? We want to protect individual rights above all else. And theoretically, if we give everyone a substantial amount of rights when they're going through the criminal justice process, no one will be found guilty who is innocent, because there'll be so many checks and so many rights given. But we know that if we give everybody a substantial number of rights, some guilty people are going to go free. Under the due process model, we're completely fine with that. We would rather 100 guilty people go free than one innocent person be convicted. That's the due process model, by providing as much rights as possible to ensure that you have a functioning justice system, one that's fair, one that's balanced. And we've seen these throughout history. We go through flips and flops throughout history. We'll look at it in a second. The other model we look at, and it's been fairly large in the 1980s and kind of switched to middle ground now, is the crime control model. Crime control model emphasizes basically one thing: convictions. All right? Crime control model only cares about conviction, only cares about stopping crime. We don't necessarily care about individual rights. We don't like individual rights that much if we're in the crime control model. Right? We don't like it that much, because what we like to see is speed and finality. We don't want you having endless appeals. We want you to serve your sentence, theoretically become reformed, rejoin society as a functioning member. So from the crime control model, we can't understand why the due processors would let an obviously guilty defendant go just because the police messed up. Right, so theoretically, you have a guy, I had a client one time, unbelievably guilty. I mean, this client, like, he got into a really bad accident, right? And it was so bad they took out his rib cage, replaced it with this mesh wire metal thing. And he was on a lot of drugs, right? Oxycodone. He didn't take his drugs. He sold his drugs. Police caught wind that he was selling drugs, right? So they send an unmarked police car to sit in front of his house to see the people coming and going with the drugs. He knows that they're there. He knows they're police officers. Every morning he went out and waved at them, usually holding a bag in his hand. Police arrest him, right? And they arrest him without a warrant. That's basically, there's this whole long story. They arrest him without a warrant. He was obviously guilty. I mean, like, he basically sang it in front of you. Yeah, I did it. Woo! Very obviously guilty guy. He didn't because of some other stuff, but theoretically, he could have been set free. Because anything that the police found when they arrested him without the warrant, when they went to his house, falls under the exclusionary rule. And it means that we don't consider it as part of evidence. Well, it's really hard to charge somebody with possession of drugs, distribution of drugs, if you don't have drugs. Right? So there's a whole other portion of that story. But for now, just kind of think of those terms. Should he have been allowed to go free, even though he was obviously freaking guilty? Right? And that's where the crime control law comes into play. That's where they're saying, like, look, some innocent people they'll get locked up in our process, but we'll make sure every single guilty person doesn't go free, that they're punished for their crimes. Right? So these kind of seem like polar opposites, and they are. We've never been fully due process. We've never been fully crime control. We've always kind of been somewhere in the middle. Right? We'll lean directions, depending on administrations, depending on congressional leadership, et cetera. We'll lean certain ways. We'll never fully set foot in one camp or the other. So, here's kind of how we see this evolve, right? So, we were crime control law basically from the founding of our country up until 1930s. Right, 1930s. Obviously, we're in the midst of a depression. And what we start to see in the 1930s is the due process laws start to emerge as being more and more and more relevant and more controlled. Right? So 1930s is the first time we have a case that invokes the 14th Amendment. Basically, a guy was arrested at a state level. He wasn't given access to certain fundamental rights that you get in the federal system. He got convicted, he sued, he basically appealed. He went on all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said, yeah, if the feds give that right, then state, you have to give it that right. We're not granting it to everyone and everything. We do it case by case. Well, right by right, I should say. That's what we see in the 1930s. And it emerges, and it comes way out in the 1960s. It ends in 1969, right? Our very, this was a very large one, is 1960s. What happens in the 1960s? The country is kind of in this state of, well, it's not like it's dead, but it's not 50. State of great controversy, of great turmoil. Right, thinking about like the Civil Rights Act, right? So Jim Crow laws were very much in this time. And we see a very liberal Supreme Court, specifically under Chief Justice Lowell Warren, announcing criminal rights like crazy. Right, so probably from like 1960 to 1969, the Warren Court, the Supreme Court of the United States, we address them by who the Chief Justice is. So right now it's the Warren Court. But under the Warren Court, we see this articulation of a large number of rules, saying, oh, state can do this now, state can do this now, feds and states can do this, right? The Supreme Court fills it in. We'll talk about what Congress tried to do in a minute. But we see one of the biggest rights, and ones you probably all know of, the right to counsel comes out of this. So we didn't have the right to counsel until the mid-1960s. Right? So when you think about your parents' age. Right? So it's not that long ago that you did not have the right to an attorney. Right? So we see that in Miranda. It's Miranda rights, you have the right to silence, say for a law, you have the right to attorney, you understand rights. That whole spiel. Where does that come from? Yeah, Supreme Court just made that shit up. Like they were completely like, oh, you have to say this now. Well, what happens if Congress says no? Somebody files a lawsuit, then it goes where? Right back up to the Supreme Court. Like the Supreme Court's like the ultimate arbitrator of the law, or arbiter of the law. So the Supreme Court just makes this crap up as it goes along. Then Chief Justice Earl Warren, there's a picture of him in my office, and then he dies, and then we have the Berger Court. The Berger Court, with the other one, is what we see right after the 1960s. You see a pretty significant rise in crime. And so the Berger court said, we got to start pulling back some of these rights. Because we see that these rights are just like, they're skyrocketing. So the Berger court said, we're going to back off a little bit. And did some backing off from the Warren court. But it did signal a change on the horizon. Right, so this kind of gives you an idea of what we see in terms of the rise of crime. Right, these are 1960s. 1960s, we have a huge rise in property crime. Right, and violent crime, this might not seem significant, but like this is murders and shit, so like even a little fluctuation is not great. Property crime that includes everything from theft to smashing mailboxes. Right, it's a very inclusive thing. We see it skyrockets until it gets to 1969. 1969, Earl Warren dies, and Berger takes over. So, what happens? Because of this rising crime in 1968, Congress decided to, this is the first time they used the term, get tough on crime. You might hear every politician in the world say that. I will be tough on crime. So, what did it do? It passed the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act of 1968. And what it did, Congress tried to subvert the Supreme Court. Congress tried to say that now you have to allow involuntary confessions. We can warrantless wiretapping. And the list goes on and on and on. Congress passes this law that's basically like trying to repeal everything that the Supreme Court has done up to this point in terms of giving people rights. All right, so now we've just gone from leaning very hard due process, now we're starting to get further crime control. So, it also created the Law Enforcement Administration, which is a public agency. And then again, 1969, we have Berger, excuse me, he embraced the crime control model, but his limitation of the rights of people, he did not go as far as Congress wanted. In fact, they declared a lot of things unconstitutional, like the involuntary confessions. They said, no, that's unconstitutional provision. Right, so they still had some due process, but they didn't go as far as Congress wanted them to take people's rights. That being said, when the Supreme Court said, look, Congress, we get what you're trying to do, but we're not taking all of the people's rights away. We put some caps on them and things like that. We're not taking them away. So Congress jumps on the Supreme Court's kind of new position of, we'll consider some stuff, and passes legislation accordingly. Specifically, two things that come out are one, the Three Strikes Law, and two, the War on Drugs. Talk about each very quickly. Three Strikes Law. You haven't heard of it before. It's active in the federal government, California, several other states. Not every state has it. Basically, what it is if you commit 3 felonies, on your 3rd felony, you get a sentence of life in prison. Now, California is under actually federal court order to release like 80% of its prisoners. Because so many people got sentenced to life, they actually, in the past 10 years, California have built 1 college and 12 prisons. Right, just to deal with this fluctuation of people. When we say the Three Strikes Law was a little bit problematic, it didn't say violent felonies. This could be, you stole a pair of tennis shoes, right? They were Reebok or whatever, over the threshold from misdemeanor to a Class A felony. You go to life in prison because you stole tennis shoes. Right, so again, from kind of a policy standpoint, we understand what they're trying to get at, but they didn't limit it to just violent crimes. States are now repealing it. California is in the middle of repealing the whole law and reworking it. And then in the 1980s especially, we see the war on drugs. right? What happens in the 1980s is we have the introduction of crack into the American drug network. All right, so if you know what crack is, basically crack is just powder cocaine mixed with some other substances to form a little ball that you can see. All right? But it derives from powdered cocaine. That's important to keep in mind. And the reason it's important to keep in mind, we'll get to it, is the 500 to 1 ratio. But basically, with war on drugs, both political parties now agree that the war on drugs is arguably the biggest failure in American domestic policy to date. Doesn't work. And what we see is we have racial implications come from this lovely new policy of war on drugs. Right, we got tough. Drug sentences went through the roof. Right, we gave police departments new funding for drugs. We see drug testing labs. We see everything went through the roof. What we see is a racial and economic disparity with the 500 to 1 ratio. So basically, what 500 to 1 ratio said was, or was allocated was, is that you had 500 grams of powdered cocaine, and by the way, cocaine is really expensive, like really expensive. So only upper middle class and middle class people really use cocaine that much, right? So college students get their hands on some, but do it. If you have 500 grams of powdered cocaine, you would get the same sentence as someone who had 1 gram of crack cocaine. And we see the crack cocaine in obviously poorer areas, right? You can't afford the good stuff, so you have to get the kind of boiled down crack. And what we see is a racial disparity starts to emerge. Right, again, keep in mind that at this time, and it's still true to this day, there are a lot of disproportionate number of minorities living in poverty. Right? Again, it's a very long history leading up to this point. But this is where we're at. So that being said, after we see the Obama administration said, hey, this is really dumb. Right? Like 500 grams to 1, are you kidding me? So they jumped it down to not 1 to 1, which would make sense. They jumped it down to 17 to 1. So if you have 17 grams of crack or powder cocaine, you get the same sentence as somebody who has 1 gram of crack. That was the negotiated rule, right? Democrats wanted an equal playing field. They're more due process oriented. Republicans said, no, we need to make sure that this crack is made. You would need a crack. Yeah, like we have the kids around campus. From opioids and all that jazz. So Republicans are working on that, and they're like, look, if we limit this down, we were actually down, more people are going to start using. We don't want that to happen. So we came up to this 17 to 1 ratio, again, which was just an agreement between the two parties of what they both could deal with, what they could live with. So arguably not perfect, but we're on a path of now recognizing that the criminal justice system is fundamentally broken. To give you an idea, move this little window out of the way. There we go. Once we hit after we hit the 1980s, so this is the end of the 1980s. Down here, but this is the end of the 1980s. This is the beginning of the 1900s, or 1990s, and then up to 2000s. Looking at this chart, which way would you say we have leaned, at least until 2013? We've been more due process or more crime control? Said due process. Who said that? Why?
Because the trend of due process is less criminals go away.
So in that case, wouldn't we see the incarceration rate fall? This is the incarceration rate. So you can guess what's happening, right? Is we start putting people in prisons, warehousing people in prisons. Even though, yes, there was a spike in the 1980s and the early 1990s, and then crime drops precipitously, right? And crime drops a huge amount. Huge amount. But they overlap here. What that tells us is when we get to here, we have the same number of criminals, we're just putting them in prisons at greater rates. So instead of things like probation, community service, things like that, tells us we're still turning to prisons. Right? So violent crime falls, property crime falls, and unlike what most people believe, today we have the lowest violent crime rate that we have in recorded history in the United States, and the lowest property crime rate that we have in recorded history in the United States. And I say that because it's been true of every administration, right? Since we kind of got onto the this big bump up here before we started falling, it was true of the Obama administration, the Trump administration, it's falling. Now again, you have two different kind of administrations, right? You have one that arguably criminal justice, or due process, President Obama. Then you have one arguably who is crime control with President Trump, but the crime rate still continues to fall regardless of what's on. So you are now safer than you've ever been. The problem is, studies show, I think I have a media of fear and crime. Okay, well, before we get to it, we'll talk about this real quick. This is just the incarceration rates in the United States, 1970 to 2013. These are jails, so these are like local issues, misdemeanors. State prisons, felonies. Federal prisons, felonies. You can see there's a notable shift in a certain direction, right? So even though today, even though crime is at its lowest rate, incarceration is at its highest rate. Now, I might tell you, like, oh, maybe people in prison is lowering the crime rates. Well, we would expect the crime rate to fall too, right? That's falling. So is prison working? Answer is no. I'll tell you why. So prison sentences have gotten longer and longer and longer. So we have more people in prison than ever, right? And we still have people committing the same crimes. Like we always have new generations coming in, and filling the prisons, filling the prisons, filling the prisons, getting larger and larger and larger. Now the problem with that is when you get to prison, you normally come out much more violent than you did going in. You have mental health issues, it exacerbates it. I mean, it's an all-around sort of experience. 95% of prisoners will be released. I mean, 95% of the people who are in prison right now will come back into the community at some point. So we have incentive to make sure that we're doing the right things with them. And what we see is we have the highest recidivism rate in the world. Recidivism is just basically people who are released from prison who reoffend and come back. And we have the highest in the world. So we're just warehousing people, and it's not doing any good. We're just keeping the same people going through the process, and now we're adding different generations to the process, thinking that if we just put them in prisons, it'll fix it. But theoretically, if we're putting people in prisons and it fixed it, this would be going down too. Or they'd be going down together, same trajectory. But you have one going down, one skyrocketing up. Right? So it's not working. We're just putting new and new generations and newer generations into prison. When we think about the crime control model, one thing I want to say is it is disproportionate. All right, so this is where the race issues come into play when we're talking about prisons. So, the United States has the highest incarceration rate in the world, both in terms of number of people and per capita. Highest people in land and free has the highest incarceration rate in the world. Overall, about 1%, that's going to be a little bit more, but about 1% of the United States population is in prison. Aims about 1%. When we have like 400 million people, that's a good number of people in prison. That being said, when we look at populations, prison populations definitely have a racial component to it. And I say that because this is racial population. We look at the racial populations in prison. So we have 2.3% of the Black population, like the world or US population. 2.3% of the US population is Black and is in prison. Almost 1%, 0.96% of Latinos, again, in the United States, they're in prison. 0.38% of whites in the United States are in prison. Now, what's our problems here? There's a few of them, right? The first being whites are the predominant race in the United States. So you would think that should theoretically be at 1% or higher, right? If we had true equality, all these rates would be at 1%. All of these lines would be at the same percentage. Instead, we have this Black population in prison, Latino population in prison, white population in prison. What we would see, especially in a very problematic Black population, is 2.3% of the Black population is in prison. Well, if we have 1% of our population in total in prison, then each one should reflect 1%. And by not reflecting 1%, we see there's a massive disparity in getting prison sentences if you're Black versus if you're white. Let's see, 3. What is it? 8 times greater chance of going to prison if you're Black than if you're white for the same crime. Because we know from studies that generally speaking, across all races commit crime, they commit crime at the same rates. You might think to yourself, oh, no, crime? Bullshit. Everyone, generally speaking, will commit between 1 and 3 felonies in their lifetime and a slew of misdemeanors. Think about your first week here so far of your freshman campus. How many of you have consumed alcohol since being here? It's okay to raise your hand. I don't give a spot. Guess what? You committed a misdemeanor. Will you ever get caught or charged for it? No. No. Then we have privilege. Right? Not only racial privilege, we have privilege in terms of you actually get to go to college. You have some kind of support system, you have funding, all that does go to college. You'll get away with it. If you're poor, you don't get away with it. Not in college, but you're kind of at home, sitting on the porch drinking or whatever, get popped for it. So I mean, it's just this really interesting dynamic. And again, we see that these should all be at 1%. But if you compare blacks to whites, that doesn't make any sense, especially if we commit crimes at the same rate. And so that should be even bar, it should be 1% all the way down. So there is a disparity. Now, so despite efforts, costs, and extremely high recidivism rates from our mass incarceration system, public support of get tough measures remains extremely high. If you want to be elected, go with the get tough mentality, get tough movement, and just say get tough. But that's enough for people like that. Yeah, that's right. All you need to do. In part, this is supported by the media. Right? which only 5% of extraordinary cases receive attention in the local news, and 1% of extraordinary cases receive attention in the national media. Think about like trials that you know about, and you know the details of. Famous ones, right? If I say O.J. Simpson, most of you, probably all of you, are going to know who he is, what he's accused of, all that, right? And there's controversy who's guilty or not. I mean, he did write a confession book that's if I did it, but he was found not guilty. He was later in a civil case found liable and went to prison for armed robbery and stealing. But O.J. Simpson, was he guilty? That's a question that gets asked every criminal justice class because everybody knows it. But if that's all the national media is covering, you're going to think, oh wow, murders are up. Think about, does everybody know who Casey Anthony is? Okay, so I'm just going to say this. Please, don't foul and Casey Anthony, that bitch is fucking guilty as hell. Like, she killed her kid and then went out to kiss it. Like, holy shit. But let's see what Casey Anthony is. Why? Because they got national attention. Now, what we actually see is national attention only gets played is if the victim is an attractive white female. O.J. Simpson case. Yes, he was a famous football player, but his victim, well, there's two, but the main one was attractive white female. Casey Anthony, she had a very cute kid. Casey Anthony attractive herself, but she had a very cute kid, just like Jonathan A. Ramsey. I know that name. Right? So we see commonalities. We all know it. Even though some of you probably weren't even alive for it, you know about it. Right? And again, most of the population in the United States is white. We only report on news like Natalie Holloway, our bird going this. She was a very attractive white woman. National news played that forever. So again, it doesn't help when all you see when you turn on the news, see, that's true. If you do it on local news or national news, all you see is crime, 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 death, 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 death. Maybe a cute puppy story, crime, 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 crime. Right? So we've actually had studies that show people are more afraid of crime now, even though it's at its lowest point, than they have ever been in U.S. history. Media is part of the blame. In addition, we have, unfortunately, 9/11. When 9/11 hits, people's fear of crime goes off the damn charts. So even though we're at the lowest crime rate, our tiniest crime rate, we fear crime more now than we ever have. What's life living in fear? This. So it's very problematic, and it doesn't, the media doesn't report the full picture. Right? They're out for ratings and money. And one of the worst things that we ever did was say that the nightly news got commercials. I see they're trying to attract advertisers, so you don't get the full story. Well, we don't get the full picture in general. So what we actually see as the media, we have a couple models we look at. One's the wedding cake model. So layer one of the wedding cake model is celebrated cases. When we say celebrated cases, we just mean the ones like everybody knows. Casey Anthony, those are the ones that receive media attention. Layer one and layer two receive media attention. Right? So if you just get the serious, all you hear about when you turn on the news is serious felonies, we're talking murders, rapes, etc., and the celebrated famous cases, that's all you hear about. You're not a criminal justice major. What do you think? Crime is out of control. But the problem is, we don't cover these. the less serious felonies, and the misdemeanors. Right, the difference between a misdemeanor and a felony. Felony is anything that will get you over a year in prison. Misdemeanor is under a year in jail. This is what you all do on a weekly or daily basis, depending on your alcohol references. This doesn't get reported, but look how massive it is. And these misdemeanors aren't against people. There's no reason to fear misdemeanors. Right? There's reasons to fear rape and murder and all that. There's reasons to fear those. But there's not reasons to fear down here. But down here is where our crime rate's at. We got rid of this, our crime rate would be close to zero. We got rid of these two things, close to zero. So that kind of gives us what the picture really is, right? The media only shows us the top two layers and we're freaking out. Media doesn't put it in context and say, but don't worry, realistically, because our crime rate, based on crime rate, it's actually based on misdemeanors, things you don't have to be afraid of, right? Like drinking in public, all that stuff. We also have the funnel model. The thing I want to bring up here with the funnel model is what actually happens from what the media reports. Right, so let's say media reports 100 arrests by the police. Of those 100 arrests, 30 go to the juvenile justice system. 20 are diverted or rejected from the prosecutor. So of our original 100, we have 70 that go to the prosecutor. The prosecutor is the guy who decides whether charges get filed or not. Not the police, not the victim, nothing. Like when people say victim's not facing charges, that's bullshit. It's not up to the victim. It's up to the prosecutor. So prosecutors have here at 7. From that 70, 10 will get thrown out by the judge. 35 will plead guilty, and only 5 will go to trial. At trial, we'll have 2 that are acquitted. So of original 100, only 38%, or excuse me, 38%, or number 38, are convicted. Of our original 100, only 38. 14 of whom are sentenced to probation. Basically, go home, wear an ankle bracelet, go up and have a crime. 12 are sentenced to incarceration for less than a year. So 12 of the original 100, 12% go to the county jail. Then the remaining 12 are sentenced to more than 1 year in prison. All right, and they go up on the hill. So of original 12, excuse me, of original 100, only 12% merited in prison. So it gives you an idea of where our crime rate really is at. Now, in a future class, we're going to talk about how we measure crime. Any statistics and stuff like that. I'm sorry, it's the boring part. We have to get through it. I just like, just show me the number. I don't care. But this gives you an idea of what gets reported, right? Again, this is what happens in real life. Not what you see in the media. This. Out of the original 100 arrests, only 12% go to prison. But we have the highest prison rates in the world. So think about that, right? It seems like a little bit of cognitive dissonance comes into play. So that being said, next class, we're going to start talking about criminal law, looking at what criminal law is. That's a good starting point. You have to know what criminal law is before you can get into anything else. And in class a little bit early so that we can wipe down the tables. Okay, make sure to do that after the class. So make sure you sign in on the attendance sheet. Grab a bottle, spray your towels, and wipe down the area. Not just your area, but everything.